When a young boy is left behind at a wildlife reserve, a lion notices him crying on the road. This fearsome big cat locks eyes with the boy and releases a powerful roar as he starts charging towards him. What follows is truly incredible. And then Scout circled around the boy whose cries were growing louder. It was early in the morning and there was no one else nearby. Scout, the massive lion, paced back and forth, the morning breeze flowing through his impressive mane. Suddenly, he stopped and stared directly at the boy. The child's cheeks were red and swollen from crying, and he looked at the big cat with tear-filled eyes. The lion raised his head and roared, baring his teeth in a fierce display on the dusty road. The boy had nowhere to run. Scout roared once more, staring at the child with anger flashing in his eyes. Scout had lived at the safari reserve ever since Ethan, a wildlife ranger, had rescued him as a cub. Ethan had discovered Scout nestled against his mother's lifeless body after poachers had attacked her. The cub was far too young to survive without his mother, so Ethan took him in, getting up at all hours of the night to feed and care for him. Ethan had worked at the reserve since he was 16, and he understood how crucial it was to integrate Scout with other lions as soon as possible before he grew too dependent on humans. The large reserve had several lion prides, and Ethan just hoped that one of the experienced moms would take Scout on as her own. So, as soon as the cub was strong enough, the ranger placed him in the care of a lioness who had just had her third cub. She was a fiercely protective mom, but one of the most gentle lionesses Ethan had ever seen. A combination that he prayed would work in Scout's favor. Thankfully, the ranger's experience had taught him well, and the lioness accepted Scout. Ethan was beyond happy with the outcome, and over the next few years, he watched as Scout grew up and separated from the pride. Male lions were solitary creatures, and leaving the safety of the pride for the first time was always dangerous. Ethan knew that Scout's chances of survival were better in the reserve, but there was still a chance he would encounter a more dominant male, and the two would fight over territory or females. The lion prides were Ethan's favorite part about working at the reserve, but he made sure to closely track Scout at all times. Having rescued him as a cub, the young ranger had a personal interest in the lion's survival. But Scout would soon do something that Ethan could never imagine. Despite his tough start in life, Scout seemed to establish himself well in the reserve. His bravery, fierce attitude, and huge size soon saw him become one of the most dominant males on the reserve. Ethan knew there had been many fights where Scout had come out on top. It wasn't nice, but it was nature, and the animals lived on the reserve as they would in the wild. The only difference being that here they were safe from poachers, and if needed, there was a veterinary team ensuring the survival of the animals was important, as many were endangered species. Although Ethan did worry about Scout from time to time, he knew he was in the best place. As much as the reserve did its best to protect the animals from poachers, they had recently experienced a few issues with hunters making their way onto the reserve. Although no animals had been hurt yet, it was now of the utmost importance to strengthen the boundaries around the reserve and stop the poachers. It was through these weakened boundaries that Scout would find himself coming face to face with a crying child. The solitary lion awoke from his slumber. The sun was rising, and the lions were the most active in the cooler parts of the day. Scout's stomach let out a low growl, and the lion lazily stretched. It was time to hunt. Finding food while not being part of a pride could be tough, but Scout seemed to manage well enough. The huge lion stood and stretched again, his giant paws reaching out in front of him, but something caused the lion to stop. A sound carried by the breeze, and an odd, familiar scent in the air caught his attention. The lion followed his senses, and suddenly, on the dirt road, he spotted an abandoned crying boy. Scout licked his lips and advanced towards the child. The little boy was sitting in the middle of the road. The hood of his blue jacket was pulled up over his head. He couldn't have been more than 3 years old, and his cries were loud and distressed. The lion kept his distance, but began to circle the little boy, never taking his eyes off the child. The sound was piercing, and Scout's behavior was changing by the second. The lion was now pacing back and forth as if feeling conflicted about the situation. Suddenly, he stopped. There emerged a new scent in the air. Scout sniffed, and his hackles raised. He locked eyes with the little boy, whose face was swollen from crying. Scout let out a terrifying roar, his teeth bared. The little boy was shocked into silence. Anger seemed to fill Scout's eyes, but the child noticed the lion wasn't looking at him. He was looking over his shoulder. Suddenly, Scout charged towards the little boy and jumped over his head. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. A terrible thumping sound caused the little boy to turn around. Pinned on the floor was a second lion, and Scout was towering over him, roaring and swiping with his huge claws. The two lions engaged in a brief fight, but the second lion was no match for Scout. As Ethan made his way down the dirt road, unaware of the unbelievable sight that was about to greet him, the second lion struggled in an attempt to free itself from Scout's claws. The ranger rounded the corner and spotted the two lions fighting. Not an unusual sight in his job, but when he saw the little boy just a few feet away from the lions, he felt sick. He had no idea how a child had gotten into the reserve, but he knew he was in danger. Ethan stepped down on the pedal, launching his jeep at high speed towards the boy. The second lion freed itself from Scout's weight and limped away as the larger lion roared and turned back to the child. Ethan loved Scout more than anything in the world, but had he harmed the little boy, it would have been a disaster for the reserve. But what happened next almost caused Ethan to crash his jeep in shock. The huge lion lay down next to the boy, creating a protective barrier around him as he scanned his territory to make sure there was nothing else around to harm the child. What Ethan had just witnessed wasn't a fight between two lions for food. Scout had been protecting the child. He'd attacked the other lion to save the boy. Ethan thought back to the day he'd found Scout whimpering up against his mother's body. Had he seen something in the crying child that resonated with him? Whatever had happened, Ethan was amazed. The ranger really hoped he had judged Scout properly, because even with the lion protecting him, he had to get the boy out of the road and find out what had happened. If Scout wouldn't let him near the child, he didn't know what he would do. Ethan cut the engine and slowly opened the jeep door. Out of all the rangers at the reserve, Ethan was the only one Scout trusted. The young ranger could spend hours watching and tracking the lion and never be bothered by him. Scout always knew he was there, but it was like he still had a memory of Ethan rescuing him that made him treat the ranger differently. He just hoped that would now play in his favor. As he stepped out of the safety of his car, Scout watched as Ethan edged closer, but the huge lion wasn't in any rush to move. He looked the ranger up and down as if assessing his trustworthiness. With one long stretch, he stood up and strolled away. Ethan patiently waited. He'd passed Scout's test, and he wasn't about to ruin everything by rushing forward. When the lion was at a safe distance, Ethan scooped the child into his arms. With Scout by his side, the child seemed calm. But now that the lion was gone, the boy had started to cry again. Ethan had no choice but to hold on to the boy as he tried to drive carefully and slowly back to the office. All the while, his mind was racing. Why had he been abandoned on the road? He was still in shock over Scout's unbelievable actions, too. The quickest way to try and get answers about the boy was to review the CCTV footage in the hopes it had caught something. When he reviewed the CCTV from the reserve boundaries, though, Ethan saw something that broke his heart. A battered old car came into view on the footage just outside of the reserve boundary. Ethan could just about make out that the driver was a young man. After a few moments, a young woman climbed out of the car holding a child. She looked around quickly and then seemed to spot what she was looking for, a weakness in the fence. After a few attempts, she pushed her way through with the child and placed him on the dirt track where Ethan had seen him. The park ranger watched as the woman kissed the little boy on the forehead and then got back in the car without him. Ethan watched as the camera showed the little boy looking for his parents, but they were gone. Ethan felt more confused than ever. The forehead kiss had been tender and loving, and something told Ethan that the woman had felt like she had no choice but to abandon the little